All right, hey everyone. Facebook Live. Thanks for joining us. Greg Mescall here with you for At Home with USA Water Polo, joined by Olympic champion, two-time medalist Betsey Armstrong. Betsey, good to see you.
Hey, Greg. Good to see you too.
So today we're talking about a couple of different topics as part of our At Home Advanced, and it's about kind of athlete development as it relates to things like being a good teammate, being coachable, that sort of thing. And then after that, we'll get a bit into athlete identity. So I'll kind of start first on kind of being a good teammate. And people are starting to get back into the pool a little bit. Other people are not. So this is good for both crowds. For you, when you were playing, what did a good teammate look like? What was some of the traits you liked in teammates that you worked well with?
For me, I think it was it's all about your relationships with your teammates, right? And it's about your individual relationship. And I think, looking at the entire arc of my career, looking back, the most effective and most memorable relationships were the ones that both sides were willing to kind of dive into at a deeper level, right? So you spend so much time together when you're playing a sport like water polo, you're training, you're in the pool together all the time, you're going to games and traveling. But it's really important to put the time in sort of outside of that water polo setting, right? And understand who your teammate is as a person, what kind of drives them outside of the pool as well, so that you can learn how to support them as best as possible in the pool.
And I think another question that we get a lot, so that's kind of that peer-to-peer relationship. And we've had ODP coaches on a couple of weeks ago and other coaches during this whole pandemic time. And it comes up a lot, but the idea of being coachable, right? So there's this skill component, maybe this natural ability that you come into playing a sport with, but then you need to get coached. And if you play water polo and you play at a high level, you're going to get coached by a lot of different people as you progress. How do you be a coachable athlete? What does that look like to you if you think back to when you were playing and when you worked well with coaches?
Yeah, it's really important, right? And I think the longer you play and the more experience you have, in some ways, it can become more difficult to be a coachable player, because you get confident and you sort of are getting better at your skill and your craft. But really, the best athletes, the most coachable athletes, are the ones who are just dying to learn all the time and have an open mind. And I think that, if what I talk to my athletes a lot is, you have to have this amazing ability to zoom out and zoom in and know when to do that. And just, if you're in a new situation and you have a new coach, giving you some feedback or giving you some pointers, it's really important to, zoom out and see how this fits into the bigger experience of you being a better player, right? And I think that, or I know that if these athletes are always coming from a place of learning and always coming from a place of wanting to be better, they'll be willing to try something and really dive in to see if it works for them or it doesn't.
And then how do you find that balance, right? Because you hit on some good things there, but I can picture someone hearing that and being like, all right, I'm going to show up to practice. And I'm going to be like, whatever you need, coach. Like, I'm here first. Like, I'm ready to help. Like, I'm going to carry like the balls to your car and I'm going to wash your car. Like, whatever you need. Like, how do you kind of like find that balance of like wanting to help out, but also like not overdoing it?
Yeah, well, comes from a deep sense of self-awareness, and that just takes a long time to develop, right? Something I've mentioned to many of my players is that, the most successful athletes in the world have these phenomenal abilities to just be self-aware on a certain number of different levels. One is, somatically, physically, they are self-aware in their bodies, right? Like LeBron James, Tom Brady, like they know, how it feels to make a pass and where his foot needs to be or how much force to put in, behind the ball. And they can feel all of that in their body. But they also need to be incredibly emotionally self-aware. They need to know how they respond when they get frustrated and how they respond, when things get hard and they get uncomfortable. And then they also need to be socially aware. And this is the big component, I think, when you're dealing with a coach and you're dealing with feedback or you're dealing with teammates, you have to have this self-awareness of where you are and how you're responding and how you fit into sort of this bigger, how this maybe one-on-one relationship or this sort of three-person relationship, within the context of your team, how that all fits in. And it takes a while to develop those skills.
You played on high level teams, whether it was college or with the national team, Olympic level. I think we can talk about these ideas of, well, here's all these things you want to do to be a good part of a team. And it sounds good in practice, but I'm curious from your own experience, just the benefits of when everyone is doing those things that you're talking about. how much better does that make the experience? Obviously, you want the talent, you want the results, but it has to just make it a much more enjoyable journey.
Absolutely. Again, looking back on the entire arc of my career, once again, I've played in games where we've won relatively easily, I'd say, but we haven't had the best communication. The sort of chemistry on the team hasn't been in the right place, and frankly, it wasn't really that enjoyable, And but then on the other side, I've been in circumstances where the team has been really close, right? And we've experienced sort of devastating losses, like really close games and or really, just whether that's in the pool in a game in a tournament, or whether that's just something that you're going through as a team on the road, right? Or at home, going through something difficult with a close group of people is so much more enriching. You learn so much more about yourself, and you learn why these kinds of relationships are important, frankly.
Yeah, I always like the analogy, if you think back to being in school and the idea of doing a group project, and if people aren't invested, like you'll slap it together and turn it in, but everyone's kind of annoyed and it's not all that fun. But when everyone's really invested in doing whatever the thing is, if it's home ec class and like everyone pulls their weight and you're not like the person who makes the cake and washes the dishes and all that other stuff, it's so much more rewarding when you get to the end of the road.
Absolutely. Yeah, that physics lab is going to be way more tolerable if everyone can chip in and build the tower, right?
And so all those experiences you learned as a player, how much does that inform how you act as a coach? Are you constantly thinking back to like, what would I like to hear if I was, 15 years old in this situation? How does that relate?
Oh, yeah, it really ties into it because frankly, like going into a coaching position from, playing on the national team and winning an Olympic gold medal and, like transitioning out of my own identity as a sport, I needed to like recheck myself when I'm coming in to coach these, like middle schoolers and high schoolers and college age girls and boys, like, like they're not playing on the national team in this moment, right? Like my job is, yes, to teach them high level water polo and skills that will, be valuable for them through their entire career. However, it's just critical at the age that all of these different players are at for them to learn about all of these skills that we've been talking about, and arguably more so, right? And so I think, now especially becoming a mom, becoming a parent, like has really like and having a little bit of time to recalibrate my own expectations and, how I coach has been really valuable. And this is something that every single I work as a mentor, and this is largely the work that we do in these mentor relationships that I have. And then as a coach, whether I'm doing ODP or whether I'm, volunteering or doing private lessons or clinics, I mean, there's always going to be this conversation, and there's always going to be this work about being a good teammate and everything you learn about yourself as a player, because that's, that's what's going to carry you forward.
I'm talking with Betsey Armstrong, Olympian for Team USA. If you have any questions, feel free to add them in the Facebook Live comments. It's interesting you mentioned the parent part. I've interviewed a couple of Olympians that are also moms and dads, and they always talk about the perspective that having a family has given them on what they're doing. It's interesting as you kind of add more to your plate, right? It kind of recalibrates how you feel about the other things. And when you were an athlete, you could be so single-minded on this goal, and now you have these other very important things. What sort of balance has that provided you?
Well, it's funny because as an athlete, I thought I was so balanced, I mean, I had such a regular routine, like everything. And even looking back on it now, like there are some ways in which I missed that lifestyle so much because everything was just so clear, right? Like you had your goals, you had your program, your training program, you had great food to eat, you were tired and we worked really hard, but like everything was just very organized. And so I feel like I've gone from one side of this full swing to the other where, there are days where I feel like I have no balance in my life. And so it's really I'm trying to think of a word besides recalibrated, but it's really sort of adjusted my perspective on, what balance is, and, like how I teach and how I coach and how I parent and how I live my own life and take care of myself in a lot of ways. So.
And that's a great segue into kind of the idea of athlete identity, right? So you finished playing not long after the London Games, right? playing with Team USA and then moving into other opportunities. And this has come up a lot during the pandemic because water polo was taken away from people, and that was what they knew themselves as, right? I'm a water polo player. I'm on the team in high school or club or college, and this is what I'm into, 24/7. And then the music stops, and it's like, wait a minute, and for them, right, it was very abrupt. I think maybe probably in your career, you might have had a feeling like, okay, I'm going to start maybe thinking about segueing out, but what was that like to kind of understand was it challenging to kind of get to a point of feeling like I'm many things in addition to a water polo player?
Totally. I mean, it's, I will start this by saying I love sports. I love, youth sports. I think they're one of the most powerful ways for, people to come together and learn how to work with others. And it builds so much confidence. I mean, there's just so many important skills that we learn through sport. However, I will say the one area that we don't have a great conversation around is this sort of identity and this sort of balance around sporting careers. And we see that on a very sort of serious level for professional athletes, but it also very much exists for our younger players, right? I mean, players are starting at younger ages now. They're, selecting their sports that they're going to really commit to for, an elementary school and on. And, I think that with that, we need to have this conversation, and we aren't there yet completely in terms of how we create that balance for our young people. And so with everything coming to a full stop in March, it was really, everything that I've spoken with a lot of teams, I've spoken with a lot of athletes, I've done, a lot of events such as this. And, the one thing I really have to say is like, this is a time unlike any other time that all of us have in our lives to sort of sit down and look inward. Right. And we don't have, a million things that we have to run off to. I mean, there are some very real stressors in life outside of this, but it's the time to pick up your journal and write your values down and really kind of start to learn how to be introspective in ways that we always talk about, but we don't always have time for, right? Like our young people are, I mean, they are booked from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. and it is nonstop. And so this is a really unique opportunity for that to happen.
And it's such a conundrum because we're so often told, and these are probably things that end up on posters or yearbook quotes, right? But it's like, you work hard, you get ahead. If the other guy's sleeping, you're awake and you're in the gym, and this is how you do all these things. And it's good to have goals and you want to achieve things, but then you can get so wrapped up in that there's nothing else. How do you kind of extract yourself from you want to keep pursuing these things, but you also need to give a little time to the other stuff? It sounds like you were hitting on some of those.
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard to learn how to pump the brakes, right? Especially when you're an incredibly driven person. And frankly, that's like something that I'm still really working on in my life. I read some quote the other day about how I don't know, some, yoga style quote about not forcing it. And I'm like, oh my God, I force everything. I decide I'm going to do something and I go for it. I am like the queen of forcing stuff. So I think it's work that we all will have with us for our whole lives. But something, I wanted to touch on in this is that, especially as a young person, I know when I was a high schooler, this was, something that was very present with me in my life. It's just, you sort of, you're young and you feel like you have to pick, right? Like we're choosing sports earlier. We are learning about our academic interests earlier, like when someone graduates from high school and goes on to college, it's like you're picking if you want to be pre-med or you want to be an engineer. And we have all these, you have to think about your career track. But, I think just being open to your interests is huge, and understanding that because you're an athlete doesn't mean you can't be interested in music or theater or the arts, or because you're, really into engineering doesn't mean that you can't, want to go to some outdoors camp or something. I think that we live in such a, we can all agree that our world is fairly polarized and fairly, sometimes a little bit binary, but there's this whole spectrum of how we can live, right? And none of this is mutually exclusive. We can occupy many different selves, and that's important to remember.
Yeah. For those that follow USA Water Polo social media, I thought Jordan Rainey on the women's national team had some good quotes a couple of weeks back about, and I'm paraphrasing here, right? But she was talking about, well, I'm a water polo player and I'm also a daughter, and I'm, a student athlete, or I'm just an athlete, or rather just a student, and I'm this and I'm this and I'm this. And I thought, oh, that was great. We don't really hear, and I'm certainly guilty of it, right? Just touting the results and just the athletic achievement, but it is, it sounds like very important to make sure that you kind of hit on the other side of a person too, to provide a little bit of that balance.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's like sports are so measurable, right? I mean, and so it's easy, like, this again, it's something where it's like in my former life, as a professional athlete to now has been such a shift, as an athlete, whether you're, an age group athlete or a college athlete or a national team athlete, everything is very linear and everything is very cumulative, and everything is very measurable, and there's, it's very clear. And we've talked about this, and it's just, that's great. And we can achieve so much through that frame, but it isn't the only thing, and it isn't the only way. And it's important to know that you can step away from that, and just step away from it, like to go explore a virtual museum or something, like just kind of like feed your soul a little bit in other ways. I mean, it's important to spend time with your passions, but it's like you also have to kind of expose yourself to different things in order to learn about yourself and who you are.
Yeah, I think this is probably a challenging question to pinpoint. There's probably not a definite answer for, right? But you have the two things we kind of talked about, right? So you want to be the great teammate, you want to be committed, you want to be all those things that your team needs, all the awareness, everything that's going to allow your team to succeed. But then you also need to carve out your own identity beyond your sport. That it sounds like a tough. I have the luxury of having never been a high level athlete to just look at this from the outside, but it sounds like a tough thing to try and marry those two together to do it all.
Yeah, it is. and I don't, there's no easy answer on how to get there. Again, I don't think it isn't like you get there and all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, I've like nailed it. I'm this great teammate on one side, but I have all these like, external personal interests outside of my team. I think it's just this constant, this is the self-work that goes, like, some days you're going to nail it and some days you're going to have it, and other days you're going to be like, wow, I'm feeling really depleted, or I'm feeling really drained. Like, how can I, step away? Like, what do I need? And this is where the self-awareness component becomes huge, because you're never going to just kind of get onto a certain level and stay there, right? We're constantly leveling up, we're constantly growing, we're constantly learning. And with that, sort of everything changes around us as we go. So it takes work, but that's the beautiful thing about playing a team sport, right? Like, that's why I'm so grateful for, I mean, I believe all sports are team sports in their own ways, right? But when you're actually, showing up for your team that you have to, face to face and practice with and socialize with and support every day, and compete with, there are, just very different experiences that come with that.
As you think back on and you've used the term so well, the arc of your career, which I like a lot, is there something you wish you had known when you were 16 thinking about college, or 20 thinking about the national team, when it comes to like the way you should be as an athlete, the way you should be as a teammate? Is there stuff that kind of hit you later and you're like, oh, that would have been clutch back then?
I think it's just the biggest thing looking back on my own experience is, not being afraid. I think we get, especially like, depending on where you are, you think you have to make this perfect choice, right? About where you're going to play, and especially when you're looking at college, right? Like, you really think that there's only one option and you have to figure out what that one option is for you to be the best, right? And I think that, what the reality is you could end up maybe in option A, B, C, D, or E and be really successful in any of those options. But again, we sort of get to this point where it's like, it's all or nothing. If I'm going to do well, it's going to be here at this place. And so for me, like when I was looking at colleges, I felt like by not making the choice to go to a West Coast university and pursue the national team at a young level, that, there was part of me at that age that thought like, okay, well, I guess I'm making the choice right now that I'm never going to be on the national team, and I think that I'm really grateful that I made the decision the way that I did, not necessarily like how I felt that I started like, looking back, I wish that wasn't my mentality in some ways, but I'm grateful for the experience that it was, because ultimately, like, I could be in an environment where I knew I could thrive, and I knew that I was, felt comfortable enough to be my own person and explore, rather than feel like I'm 17 years old. I have to make this decision right now. If I don't, and this is like me choosing whether or not I'm going to be the most successful I'm going to be in water polo. So I think, just it's kind of a roundabout way of saying this, if anyone got lost in that, but it's sort of like, just making sure, not being afraid, not making decisions based out of fear, and knowing that, you have the ability to be successful wherever you end up and make things happen around you wherever you are. And it's just because it isn't, one place doesn't mean it isn't at another.
Yeah, very good points there, because it can be feel like a true life or death decision there when you're kind of coming out of high school or going forward from that.
Yeah, and look at us now, right? Like in the middle of this pandemic. I mean, how are we even, our young people who are making our seniors and our juniors who are looking at colleges right now? I mean, it's just such a different, it's just wild now compared to what it was before the coronavirus. So it's just like everything's kind of changing, and we have to, it's scary. And yes, it's an important decision that should be made, with a lot of diligence, but it's also, important to know that you're young and the world's in front of you.
You said you were talking to other athletes and teams during this time. Has there been a common theme? What are people missing the most about being around water polo? I mean, I imagine it's just those relationships that we started with at the top, but what have you heard from people?
I think people are just missing playing the sport too, right? I think actually, like, we've done a phenomenal job. Our communities have done a phenomenal job connecting with one another. And that isn't to say it's been perfect this whole time, but I mean, the in-person relationships are big, and showing up and getting to practice with your teammates is huge. But even just being able to play the sport, I think that's what people miss, and being able to watch the sport. I know, excuse me, my husband is going nuts with like no water polo going on. He's like, where can I like live stream anything? So I think, I think just missing the unity of sports. That I've done so many of these talks, and it's great. I think everyone's really taking this sort of self-work seriously during this time, which is huge. We're all going to be, we're going to look back on this and see the shift that took place during this time, I think. But man, it would be nice just to be able to show up and play sports and see sports in the way that we've always done.
So very true. Betsey Armstrong, appreciate you taking the time. Always good to catch up with you, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much.